Picture number 1 shows George Hopkins in a field near Devil's Tower on the morning that he was to make his attempt to be the first person to ever parachute to this very difficult peak in Wyoming, just across the hills, across the border in Wyoming from South Dakota. George had visited Devil's Tower on the previous Sunday along with about 20 friends when he was intending to make his original parachute jump to the tower. However, in landing the plane in a small cornfield, it tipped on its nose, broke the propeller, and we had to send back to Rapid City for another prop before he could make his attempt. By the time George was ready and the prop was back at Devil's Tower, plane repaired, the wind was blowing about 40 miles an hour, and we all thought it was far too dangerous for George to make the attempt to land on the tower that day. So in late afternoon, we drove back to Rapid City. I'll never forget that George was crying on the way back because in spite of the terrible danger of trying to drop on such a small area in a 40-mile-an-hour wind, he felt that he had let down all the spectators who had driven over there to see him make this dangerous leap. Someone had suggested that George look up Bob Dean, who was a manager of KOTA and was noted as an entrepreneur. Bob Dean, myself, and a lawyer friend, Boyd Leadham, would meet with George Hopkins at the A&F Cafe in Rapid City to hear his proposition and to see if we could make any plans that would be good for publicity in the Black Hills. George told us that he wanted to set a new parachute jumping record in Rapid City, that is, jump more times in one day than anyone had ever jumped before in their lives. And he thought as a publicity stunt, before making this attempt on the world record, that he might be able to land on Devil's Tower, and that would create enough local interest so that he could attract a large crowd to the event when he attempted to break the world's parachute jumping record. Bob and I agreed to back George in his attempt at the world's parachute jumping record. Boyd Leadham, being a little more discreet, decided that he would watch from the sidelines. This first meeting occurred on September 20th, and during the next 10 days, I was constantly in touch with George. The first thing we had to figure out was how he could get off of Devil's Tower once he had jumped to the top. It was finally decided that we would take a Ford automobile axle, drive that into a crevice on top of the rock. We'd drop a small sledgehammer to him so that he could drive the axle into the rock. The axle was to be sharpened so that he could be sure and drive it deep into the rock so that it couldn't be pulled out. Then we would drop 100 foot of rope that would go over the edge of the monument, and to attach to that would be a hay pulley. Through the hay pulley, we would run a 1,000 foot length of manila rope, one end of which would be attached to George's body, and that he would lower himself down about 600 feet until he reached an area that he thought he could climb down safely. After our failure to make the jump on Sunday, it was decided that we return to Devil's Tower on Wednesday for the final attempt of a landing on Devil's Tower. On the way over to the tower, I stopped at Spearfish Airport, talked with Clyde Ice to see if he would come over and watch the parachute jump. Clyde was an old friend of mine, and he said, "Earl, I'm not going over there and watch someone kill himself because the air currents are so dangerous around Devil's Tower that no one could possibly land on there with a parachute." This frightened me more than a little, but George thought that he was such a skilled parachutist that he could make the landing without any difficulty. George had not only been a professional parachutist for many years, he had also been a stuntman, working for the motion picture industry in Hollywood, been one of the early wing walkers doing stunts on the early type planes. Seemed not to have any fear, although he had broken many bones and lost a number of his teeth in near-fatal previous accidents. A group of us who were at the tower when George made his final flight and jump on the first day of October, Wednesday. Mr. Bob Dean, the man who was promoting the jump with myself, is pictured on the left, followed by Joe Quinn, who was the pilot, then Ned Parague, who was with Bell Studios but was also the Pathé News correspondent in South Dakota, and he was there to take motion pictures of George landing on the tower. These pictures were shown all over the United States in movie theaters and showed that George jumped about 600 to 1,000 feet above the tower, but 1,200 feet to the side of it, making allowances for the wind to carry him to the tower. The other people in the photograph are Mrs. Walter P. Mullers of Rapid City, Jim Kibben, active in the Junior Chamber of Commerce, and the Junior Chamber had promised that they would back George's attempt to break the world parachute jumping record in Rapid City, the profit from which was to go to help construct a new hospital in Rapid City. The next man is Bill Richmond, followed by Jack Gensler, who worked at the Reptile Gardens and was an enthusiastic amateur aviator. Jack was later to become a professional aviator in World War II. He made 50 flights in North Africa, returned to the United States, then went back to Europe and had completed 40 more combat missions when his plane came in over an airport near Paris. It was badly shot up. Jack parachuted out, the chute didn't open, and here was a man who loved aviation and participated in this dangerous episode with George Hopkins, losing his life with a parachute. Walter P. Mullers was the manager of the Black Hills packing plant in Rapid City and a friend of Bob Dean's. And Vern Osdale, the last man on the right, was of Vern's Photoshop of Rapid City. I should mention that Joe Quinn, the pilot of the plane, worked full-time as a milkman in Rapid City, and flying a plane was only a hobby for him. The picture of the tower shows George's parachute almost to the middle of the tower, while the plane that dropped him has already moved far to the right. There was more wind than what George had expected, and he had to pull very hard on the shrouds in order to land near the center of the tower. Not only did George have to land near the center of the tower, but he also had to be careful and not land against some of the large boulders that were strewn all over the top of Devil's Tower. After dropping George on top, the plane made another pass over the tower to see that George was safe and uninjured. It then went over to a field near the base of the tower where we loaded in the rope, 1,000-foot length of rope, a 100-foot length of rope, a hay pulley, a camera for George to use while he was up there, and the sledgehammer to drive the forward axle into the top of the mountain. Jack Gensler got in the plane with Joe Quinn, and they flew over the tower to drop this material to George. With today's modern chutes, it would be easy to hit a target the size of Devil's Tower, but back in the early 40s, to make such an exacting jump with high winds was almost impossible. As soon as he could, George stood up on the tower, holding the parachute to show that he was perfectly safe. This parachute was to be his tent that he would live in for a week. It's remarkable that a man only 27 years of age would have had the experience that George had so that he could make a daring jump of this nature. It was also remarkable that he would permit myself, who was only 25 years old, to be in charge of the publicity and of making the arrangements for his equipment to undertake such a dangerous feat. The first roll of rope that was dropped to George on top of the mountain hit the top and bounced far below, landing on a ledge that George couldn't see from the top and we couldn't see from the bottom. George was yelling as loud as he could over the wind. Finally made us understand that he couldn't locate the rope, so a telephone call was made to Rapid City to have another 1,000 foot of rope brought from the Coast to Coast store so that we could make another attempt at dropping the rope to George. This time the rope was carefully strung out flat so that when it would land as a splash. Jack Gensler pushed the rope out, and in 10 minutes George yelled over the side that he had received the rope satisfactorily and would now start to untangle it. A half hour went by during which we didn't hear anything from George. Finally he yelled to us, "Did you ever try to untangle 1,000 foot of string? I can't get the rope untangled so that I can start down off the peak this night." I yelled up to George not to worry, that we would get some food and some bedding to him. In the meantime, I would start to climb the east face. So the next day I thought that I could climb the east face while he started down on the same side. We would meet in the middle and then finish the descent to the ground. I should mention that on the night that George landed on the tower, I did start to climb up the east face. I believe this face has never been climbed, but at the time it looked like the easiest one to me. I got about 20% the way up the side of the mountain when I came to a ledge that I had to work my way around, where I got into another crevice and worked my way up to a second ledge. By that time it was almost dark and the wind was blowing so hard that I was almost blown off of the tower. So I started back down, feeling sure that I could use this route the following day to get up. I came back to the ledge that I had traversed, forgot it that I had traversed it, and started down a vertical crevice that soon ended in nothing at all, and there I was perched in the dark on the side of Devil's Tower and couldn't possibly remember how I got up this far in the first place. Finally, in desperation, my mind did recall that I had made a horizontal traverse on a ledge. I climbed up to this, went across, found the vertical crevice that I'd gone down before, and got down to the ground long after dark, but plenty frightened from the experience and darn near frozen because the temperatures were down to freezing at this time. Clyde Ice was contacted in Spearfish. He brought over a flying suit, some canned goods, and other equipment such as water, which we put into hot water bottles so that when it was packed in straw it wouldn't break when it hit the top of the tower. All this was dropped to George just before dark, and George waved a last cheery goodbye and curled up in his parachute for the night. The head park ranger in Yellowstone National Park had been notified of George's landing on Devil's Tower, and he left immediately to supervise the activities that were taking place at the tower. Early the next morning, after he had spent a cold night on the top, George yelled down to tell us that he was okay and would be ready to try and climb down. However, the park ranger from Yellowstone Park forbid him to make any attempt, saying that it was certain that he would be killed, even if he did fasten the rope and try to lower himself on a hay pulley, that the rope would have so much friction on the rocks as he would start his descent that the rope would be frayed and George would certainly fall to his death. Instead, he suggested that they call 2 expert mountain climbers from Colorado National Park who felt that they could climb the Devil's Tower without difficulty and rescue George. The man bending over is Paul Petzold, who had climbed at that time higher in the Himalayas than anyone in the world, and his climbing partner, who was a tall 6'6" man called Timberline. These were 2 expert climbers, and they wanted to lead the climb to the top to rescue George. We okayed this procedure, although at the same time we were receiving threats from the park department that I would be arrested as soon as George got off the tower, and the same could be expected of George. Publicity about George's having landed on Devil's Tower had been sent out by radio by Robert Dean from the local radio station. Newspaper men began to gather from all over the country. KLZ from Denver spent a special truck with searchlights to be there to help take photographs of George when the rescue would take place, especially if the rescue should take place at night. There were literally hundreds of cars in the parking lot, and thousands of people came to view the man who was stranded on Devil's Tower. The second morning, 2 climbers arrived and started their climb up the tower. They said not to worry. They patted me on the back and said, "We'll have your buddy down in no time." By this time, a regular landing field had been set up in a field about 4 miles from the base of the tower, and we had two-way radio from the tower to the landing field. And there were planes coming and going all day long. I was at the landing field when I could see that the men had made very little progress up the tower, as I had climbed several times up to the point that they had reached, carrying pitons to them and wooden pegs that they would drive into the side of the mountain. At one point, one of the climbers slipped and fell about 20 feet and decided to give up the climb for the day. Radio station KLZ made on-the-spot broadcasts each day from Devil's Tower, and because they had taken such an interest in George and the Devil's Tower escapade, they were given exclusive rights to interview George as soon as he got off the tower. The photograph of the equipment shows the main things that we were intending to use to get George off the tower, and these were implements that George himself had requested as being what he thought would give him a very satisfactory descent from the peak. You can see the Ford axle, the small sledgehammer, the hay pulley, the 100-foot chunk of rope, the little camera in a case that was put inside the cardboard box and dropped, and the 1,000-foot of rope is in the burlap bag. And of course, being in the burlap bag is the reason that when it hit the top, it bounced and landed far below where it couldn't be reached. It was more help than you can ever possibly estimate that was given to us by Clyde Ice after George had once landed up there. Clyde took it as a personal part of his work to see to it that George was taken care of at all times. There were several ideas brought forward as to how we could help save George's life while he was on Devil's Tower. A coal company from Gillette flew over and dropped a ton of coal for him to warm himself with, and Connect Lumber Company constructed a prefabricated insulated house that would be dropped to him. Don Connect, manager of the Connect Lumber Company, helping in the construction of this prefabricated house that we were to drop to George to try and keep him warm. The picture of Newell Joyner gives him the appearance of being very concerned about George Hopkins. Actually, his main concern was about his own position with the park department. On the morning that George landed on Devil's Tower, everyone left for Rapid City except my wife and myself, who walked over to the base of the tower, where we were joined by Newell Joyner, and he asked if we had anything to do with the man who had parachuted up there. I told him yes, and he says, "Well, your little practical joke has backfired. You're not going to be able to get him off of there, and not only that, when you do, both you and the man that's up there are going to go to jail." The following day, Joyner persuaded me to sign a statement that I would pay for all costs in the rescue of George and all extra costs that the park department might incur because of George having landed on Devil's Tower. I was so anxious to get the cooperation of the park department that I signed this paper, and in so doing, I lost every cent of money I had in the world. I had saved enough for a down payment on a home that I was planning on buying in Rapid City, but every cent that I had went to pay for the expenses of climbers who were to come out later to help in the rescue. And the government billed me for every broken twig on a tree that might have been caused by the extra visitors that they had at the Devil's Tower. They hired extra stenographers, extra help, and all of this I had to pay for. Joyner still planned on placing me under arrest once George was rescued. This plan stopped when he received a call from Park headquarters in Omaha, when the headquarters there said that a blimp was being sent out to rescue George Hopkins, and that to keep up the good work, they loved the publicity. Joyner hunted me up, slapped me on the back, and he says, "Let's get our shoes polished, let's get our picture taken. We're heroes." This was the quick turnaround from my being an evil monster. All of a sudden, I was his dearest friend. I had already telephoned Jack Durrance at Dartmouth College, who had climbed Devil's Tower 2 years previously, and Durrance said that if I would pay all his expenses and that of his climbing partner, Merle McLean, that he would come out and make the climb to take George off the tower. I was so worried about George's health that I would have agreed to anything. Jack Durrance had spent a couple months planning his careful route up the tower when he had made one of the first free climbs ever made 2 years previous to this date. Jack Gensler on the left, followed by Earl Brocklesby. The man with the binoculars was a KLZ reporter, then George Hopkins and Newell Joyner on the right. A picture of George Hopkins with Newell Joyner and the KFBC microphone also shows the hat of a Wyoming highway patrolman. The instructions from the governor of Wyoming was that George was to be taken immediately to Cheyenne, where he was to be given a hero's welcome for the publicity he had brought to the state of Wyoming by his daring leap to the Devil's Tower. Naturally, George was completely exhausted when he got off the tower, and the only thing he wanted to do was to escape to Rapid City, where he could go to my home and crawl into a warm bed, which is exactly what we did. We eluded the patrolman and went to Rapid City as fast as we could go. Even in the monument headquarters, where George is again being interviewed, you can see 2 highway patrolmen in their caps waiting for the interview to end so they can whisk George off to Cheyenne, Wyoming. In the picture of George with Newell Joyner, you can tell what a small man George was. He stood only 5'6" and weighed 118 pounds, but he was absolutely fearless. He not only was a great parachutist, but after the Devil's Tower episode, he enlisted in the Army. He helped with instructions at Fort Benning, Georgia. He also was sent both to China and to Russia, where he helped in giving instructions to paratroopers there. After the war, he came back to Rapid City, set up a parachute packing school in a little airport. He had financial difficulties. He left Rapid City, and there was a period of a half dozen years where none of us knew where he was, including his mother. After not hearing from him for years, I received a telephone call one night in Rapid City. It was from George, who had arrived in town. He said, "This is George Hopkins." I said, "Great, George, I'm sure glad to see you." And he says, "Well, my wife is with me." And I said, "That's great, bring her along." He says, "Well, she's Mexican." I said, "That's all right, I can speak some Spanish." So he brought his wife, came over to the house. He had been flying as a barnstormer in Mexico and also doing some flying for the Mexican government. While down there, he had fallen in love with a very beautiful Mexican girl by the name of Adelita, and they later had 3 children, and he spent the remainder of his life in California. One day after George got off Devil's Tower, he was taken to Denver, where he appeared in the Denver Theater, along with 5 local girls who appeared as parachute packers on the stage there. There was a small amount of remuneration for this. However, this is the only money that we ever received from the parachute escapade on Devil's Tower. He drove all night to get back to Rapid City to try to break the world's parachute jumping record, and the Junior Chamber of Commerce of Rapid City was sponsoring this to raise money for the new hospital here. It was a rather windy day, and on the 3rd jump, George landed on a concrete apron, injured himself, but he insisted that he would continue his jumping. A parachute packer hadn't arrived, so George would get in the plane, go up, jump out, and then go back, stuff the parachute into the pack, never trying to pack it in any orderly manner. He would just wad it up, and he says, "Don't worry, the wall's open so far." However, after the 13th jump, the wind was so high that he would hit the ground, and he was so weak that he couldn't pull himself up by the shrouds. I remember picking him up after he had been dragged 150 feet. His face was gray. I said, "George, you can't go on any longer." He says, "Don't worry, just get me in the plane, push me out. I'll always get down somehow." But Dr. Don Bailey was present at the parachute jumping records attempt, and he examined George and told me that he couldn't possibly make another jump and live through it. So, in spite of George's protests, we put him in my car, drove him back to Rapid City, and thus ended the episode of Devil's Tower, George Hopkins.